The wooden horse hit the schoolhouse floor before Grace Whitfield had even finished writing the morning's date on the board, its chipped ears skittering across the boards toward the stove. Samuel Ashford was on his knees after it in an instant, scrambling beneath a desk without a single sound, while the boy who had knocked it from his hands laughed and called out, "Dumb boy can't even talk to ask for it back." Grace set down her chalk. She crossed the room with an evenness that gave nothing away, though something in her had gone very still and very focused, and she knelt beside the desk to help Samuel retrieve the small carved horse before she turned to face the boy who had spoken. "We do not call each other names in this room," she said, her voice carrying to every corner without needing to rise. "Not today, not any day, and certainly not about something that isn't his to explain to you." The boy's grin faltered under her gaze, and he mumbled an apology that satisfied the letter of the requirement if not its spirit, and Grace let it stand for now, understanding that some lessons needed repeating more than once before they properly took root. Mrs. Eldridge was standing in the schoolhouse doorway when Grace looked up, her narrow face composed into the particular expression of a woman who had witnessed exactly enough to form an opinion. She waited until the children had filed out for the noon recess before stepping fully inside, her skirts brushing the threshold with the deliberate care of someone unaccustomed to hurrying into difficult conversations. "The board meets in 3 weeks," Mrs. Eldridge said, without preamble. "If the boy shows no improvement by then, I intend to recommend the Denver Institute. They have proper methods there, Miss Whitfield, methods this schoolhouse simply isn't equipped to provide." "He has a name," Grace said. "Samuel." "I'm aware of his name." Mrs. Eldridge's tone softened slightly, though her resolve did not. "I am not unkind, Miss Whitfield, whatever you may think watching me from across this room. I simply believe a child who cannot speak deserves more specialized care than a country school teacher can offer him." Caleb Ashford arrived at the schoolhouse door only minutes later, his hat already in his hand, and the particular tightness around his eyes suggested he had heard some version of the morning's trouble before he'd even crossed the yard. "My son is not a problem for you to solve," he said to Grace, the words landing somewhere between a warning and a plea. Grace held his gaze steadily. "I don't intend to fix him, Mr. Ashford," she said. "I intend to give him somewhere safe enough to be heard, and I'd ask you not to mistake the two." Caleb said nothing further, though something in his expression shifted, the particular flicker of a man reassessing a stranger he'd already decided he understood. He reached for Samuel's hand, and Samuel came to him without a word, the small wooden horse clutched tight against his chest, and the two of them walked out into the bright autumn afternoon, leaving Grace standing alone, in a room that suddenly felt considerably quieter than it had a moment before. To understand how all three of them had arrived at that particular morning, it helps to go back nearly 2 years, to the winter that took Rebecca Ashford from her husband and son both. The wagon had gone down on a patch of black ice, half a mile from the Ashford ranch house. A sudden lurch and a frightened horse and a slide that ended against a fence post with a violence nobody in Willow Bend had properly recovered from since. Rebecca had died before help could reach them, and Samuel, riding beside her, had walked away with nothing more than a bruised shoulder and a silence that had not broken in the 18 months since. Caleb had buried his wife in the small cemetery behind the church, had gone back to running 1,100 acres of cattle country the following week, because the work did not care how a man's chest felt, and had spent every day since trying to be strong enough for a son who no longer had words to tell him whether it was working. He loved Samuel plainly and completely, though he had never learned, in all his own quiet grieving, how to sit with a silent child without feeling the particular helplessness of a man facing a lock he did not have the key for. Grace Whitfield had arrived in Willow Bend 6 months earlier to take the school teaching position, carrying with her a history of her own that made Samuel's silence feel less foreign to her than it did to most of the town. Her younger sister Louisa had stopped speaking for nearly 4 months after scarlet fever swept through their household 5 years before, taking Louisa's voice for a time, and very nearly taking her life along with it. And Grace had learned then, sitting beside her sister's bed night after night, that silence was not always emptiness. Sometimes it was simply a person carrying more than words could safely hold. Louisa had recovered fully in time, was married now to a druggist in Cheyenne, and wrote Grace cheerful letters full of ordinary complaints about her husband's long hours. But Grace had never forgotten the particular texture of those 4 silent months, the way well-meaning neighbors had pressed Louisa to speak before she was ready, and only driven her further into herself each time. She had promised herself then, watching her sister slowly find her way back to words on her own timing rather than anyone else's, that she would never again mistake patience for neglect, nor urgency for genuine care. She recognized that particular quality in Samuel the very first week of school, the way he watched everything with careful attention while offering nothing back, the way his hand found the small wooden horse in his pocket whenever the classroom grew too loud or too demanding. She did not press him to speak, understanding from Louisa's long recovery that pressing only taught a frightened child to guard the silence more fiercely. Instead, she gave him paper and a slate, and let him answer questions in writing when he chose to answer at all, and she read aloud most afternoons after the other children had gone home, stories about horses and open country that she noticed, within the first 2 weeks, held his attention more completely than anything else she tried. Samuel began staying an extra half-hour most days, not because anyone required it of him, but because the quiet of an empty schoolroom with only Grace's voice filling it seemed to cost him less than the crowded, noisy hours before. She began riding out to the Ashford ranch some afternoons as well, at Caleb's cautious invitation, continuing the reading in the barn where Samuel seemed most at ease among the horses he clearly loved. The gelding Samuel favored, an aging bay named Scout, would lean his head over the stall door whenever Samuel approached, and Grace noticed that the boy's hands, so careful and controlled everywhere else, moved with an easy confidence around the horse that she had not seen him show anywhere in the schoolroom. She kept a small slate hanging by a cord near her desk, specifically for Samuel, understanding that a child who felt safe writing his answers might, in time, feel safer speaking them aloud as well. Some mornings he wrote whole sentences without hesitation, describing what he'd seen on the ride to school, or what Scout had done the evening before. And other mornings he simply shook his head and kept his eyes on his own hands, and Grace let both kinds of mornings pass without comment, understanding that consistency mattered more than any single day's progress. "He talks to the horses," Caleb told her one evening, watching from the barn doorway as Samuel worked a brush along Scout's shoulder in slow, deliberate strokes. "Not words, but something. The horse always seems to know what he means, even when the rest of us are left guessing. Animals don't need him to explain himself," Grace said. "That's likely why it's easier." Caleb considered that a long moment, his weathered face working through something he did not immediately put into words himself. "Wish I knew how to be that easy for him," he said finally, and Grace heard, beneath the plain statement, a grief of his own that had never properly found its own voice either. The weeks moved forward in small, uneven steps, the particular slow accumulation of trust that could not be rushed without undoing itself. Samuel began nodding and shaking his head more readily by the 3rd week, small gestures that had once cost him visible effort now coming almost without thought. By the 4th week, he had begun pointing to words on his slate rather than only writing full sentences, a small shortcut that suggested, however faintly, a mind growing less guarded about being understood quickly. It was on an ordinary Tuesday in the 5th week that the barn nearly cost them everything they had built. A young foal, barely broken to lead, spooked at a sudden clap of thunder and bolted for the open barn door, and Grace, closest to the gate, called out before she had time to consider the words at all. "Samuel, hold the gate." And Samuel, without a single moment's hesitation, without the careful deliberation he brought to every other action in his life, planted his small body against the swinging wood and called back, clear and unmistakable, "I've got it." The foal skidded to a stop against his held gate, snorting and wild-eyed but contained, and for one suspended second the whole barn seemed to hold its breath along with everyone in it. Then Samuel's face changed, the particular startled horror of a boy who has just heard his own voice for the first time in 18 months and does not know what to do with the sound of it. He did not speak again that afternoon. He clung to Scout's stall door with both hands, his breathing quick and shallow, and Grace crossed to him slowly, kneeling to his level without reaching for him, giving him the same wide, unhurried space she had given him every day since school began. "That was very brave," she said quietly. "You don't have to do it again until you're ready. Once was enough to prove it's still there." Caleb, who had come running at the commotion, stood frozen in the doorway with an expression Grace had not seen on him before, something between joy and heartbreak that seemed too large for his face to properly hold. He said nothing that evening about what he'd witnessed, though Grace noticed, in the weeks that followed, that he began sitting with Samuel in the evenings in a way he had not managed since Rebecca's death, simply present, simply patient, learning by her example the particular value of company that asked nothing in return. Their own conversations grew longer through those same weeks, evenings on the porch after Samuel had gone to bed, or rides home through early autumn rain when Caleb insisted on driving her back to town, rather than letting her ride alone in weather turning foul. He mended the schoolhouse stove one Saturday without being asked, arriving before dawn with tools and lumber, and Grace found him there when she came to prepare for Monday's lessons, sawdust on his sleeves and a rare, unguarded smile when he saw her reaction. "Didn't want the children catching cold on my account," he said, though they both understood the gesture carried more weight than a simple stove repair required. She told him about Louisa one evening, the fever and the long silent months and the particular fear of watching someone you loved disappear into their own grief without any clear path back. Caleb listened with the same stillness Grace had learned to recognize as his version of full attention, and when she finished, he was quiet a long moment before speaking. "Been afraid the same way about my own boy," he admitted. "Afraid if I let myself grieve Rebecca properly in front of him, I'd break something that's already too fragile to bear the weight of it." "Grief shared isn't the same as grief that breaks a person," Grace said. "Sometimes it's the only thing that proves to a child he isn't the only one carrying something heavy, and that the people around him are strong enough to carry it too." Caleb did not answer that directly, though the following week, Grace noticed a small photograph of Rebecca appear on the mantel where none had stood before, and Samuel, passing it each morning, had begun pausing briefly to look at it rather than avoiding the space entirely as he once had. The board's deadline arrived faster than any of them felt properly ready for, and the evening before the meeting, Samuel woke from a nightmare loud enough that Grace, staying late that particular night to help Caleb prepare supper, heard him crying out from down the hall. She reached his room before Caleb did, finding Samuel sitting upright in bed, the wooden horse clutched so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, tears streaking a face still caught between sleep and waking terror. She sat beside him without touching him first, letting him find his own way toward whatever comfort he needed, and it was several long minutes before Samuel spoke at all, his voice thin and broken in a way that told her this cost him more than the barn ever had. The wooden horse sat clutched between his two small fists the entire time, its worn shape pressed so hard against his chest that Grace could see the faint mark it would likely leave against his skin. "Mama didn't want to take the wagon that day," he said. "I begged her to go. It was my fault." Grace felt something crack open in her own chest at the sound of it. The particular weight a 7-year-old had been carrying alone for 18 silent months, finally spoken aloud. She did not rush to comfort him with easy reassurance, understanding that a wound held that long deserved a response as honest as the confession itself. "You asked for a ride, Samuel," she said gently. "You did not cause the ice on that road. You did not spook the horse, and you did not build the fence post your mother's wagon struck. Those things happened to both of you. None of it was a thing you did." Samuel cried harder at that, a full, unguarded weeping that seemed to pull loose something that had been knotted tight inside him for a very long time. And then, exhausted, he grew quiet again, retreating for a moment into the familiar silence that had protected him so long. Grace stayed until his breathing evened into sleep, and when she finally stepped into the hallway, she found Caleb standing there, having heard enough of it through the thin walls to understand exactly what his son had just carried alone since the accident. "He thinks it's his fault," Caleb said, his own voice rough. "All this time, and I never once thought to ask him plainly whether he believed that." "Now you know," Grace said. "That's not nothing, Caleb. That's the whole of what he's needed someone to hear." The school board convened the following evening in the church hall, a modest gathering of 6 members with Mrs. Eldridge presiding from the front table, and word of the meeting had drawn enough of Willow Bend's families that the room sat nearly full by the time proceedings began. Neighbors who had watched Samuel grow up alongside their own children filled the back rows, and Grace felt the particular weight of a whole community waiting to see how this evening would resolve. Grace spoke first, laying out plainly what progress Samuel had made, the written communication, the growing willingness to engage, the single clear sentence in the barn that proved his voice had never truly left him. Mrs. Eldridge listened with the same composed attention she brought to everything, though her expression remained carefully neutral throughout, and when Grace finished, she asked a fair question rather than a dismissive one. One sentence in a moment of crisis is not the same as sustained progress, Miss Whitfield. What assurance do we have that this isn't simply a hopeful mother's account of a single fortunate afternoon? It was Samuel himself who answered, rising from his chair beside Caleb before anyone thought to stop him, his small frame trembling visibly as every eye in the room turned toward him. "I want to stay," he said, the words coming slow and halting, each one costing him visible effort. "Miss Whitfield listens. Nobody else ever waited long enough to hear me." The room went entirely silent, the particular silence that follows something nobody quite expected to witness, and Mrs. Eldridge sat very still a long moment before she spoke again. "Well," she said finally, her voice considerably softer than it had been all evening, "I believe that settles the matter more thoroughly than any report could have managed." She looked toward Grace with something that was not quite an apology, but carried its own genuine weight. "I was wrong to assume a country schoolroom couldn't offer what this child needed," Mrs. Eldridge said. "I'd ask you to continue exactly as you have been, Miss Whitfield, and I'll not raise the matter of the Denver Institute again." The board voted unanimously to let Samuel remain in Willow Bend School, and the small crowd that had gathered broke into the particular relieved murmur of a community that had been holding its own breath alongside the Ashfords without quite realizing it. Caleb knelt in front of his son right there in the crowded hall, his own composure finally giving way, and pulled Samuel into an embrace that neither of them seemed inclined to end quickly. They talked about Rebecca properly that night for the first time, sitting together at the kitchen table long after Grace had gone home, Caleb telling Samuel small ordinary things about his mother that he had been too afraid to say aloud before, the way she'd laughed too loud at her own jokes, the particular song she used to hum while working the garden. Samuel listened and asked small questions in his own halting way, and though the conversation moved slowly, it moved forward, 2 people finally grieving together, rather than each carrying the weight alone in separate silent rooms. In the weeks that followed the board's decision, Grace continued her afternoons at the schoolhouse and her evenings at the ranch with the same steady patience she had brought from the very beginning, though something had settled more easily between all 3 of them now that the deadline no longer pressed against every hour. Samuel spoke more each week, still choosing silence some days when the world felt too loud, though never again for the long unbroken stretches that had once defined him. Caleb noticed, and remarked on it once quietly to Grace, that his son laughed now, an ordinary, unremarkable sound that had once seemed impossibly distant. It was on an evening in early winter, the first real snow dusting the ranch yard white, that Caleb found himself standing at the barn door with Samuel and Grace both, watching the boy demonstrate for her, with visible pride, exactly how Scout had learned to nudge open his own stall latch. Samuel ran off afterward to fetch a blanket for the horse, leaving Caleb and Grace alone in the settling dusk, and Caleb turned to her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something searching and a little uncertain despite all his usual steadiness. "I suppose your work here is done," he said. Samuel speaking, the board satisfied. "I expect you'll have considerably less reason to keep riding out here most evenings." Before Grace could answer, Samuel came back around the corner of the barn, blanket in hand, and stopped short at the sight of them both standing there in the fading light. He set the blanket down slowly, walked over, and took Grace's hand in his own small one, looking up at her with a particular directness that had become, in these past weeks, entirely his own. "Can Miss Whitfield stay forever?" he asked. The question landed in the quiet yard with a weight none of them were fully prepared for, and Caleb looked, not at his son, but at Grace, waiting, the decision plainly not his to make on her behalf, nor Samuel's to settle simply by asking it plainly enough. Grace knelt down to Samuel's level, taking both his hands gently in hers. "That's not a question for you to ask alone, sweetheart," she said gently. "It's something your father and I need to talk about ourselves, in our own time, the way grown people decide these particular things properly. But I promise you this, wherever I end up, you'll always know exactly where to find me." Samuel considered that with the particular seriousness he brought to most things now, nodded once, and went to see to Scout's blanket without further argument, satisfied enough with an honest answer even if it wasn't the immediate one he'd hoped for. Caleb watched him go, then turned back to Grace, the barn door creaking softly on its hinge between them in the cold evening air. "He's not wrong to ask it," Caleb said quietly. "I've been wanting to ask something similar myself, only I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I was only asking on his account." "And is it only on his account?" Grace asked. Caleb was quiet a long moment, choosing his words with the same careful deliberation she had watched him bring to every difficult thing since the day they'd met. "No," he said finally. "I've watched you teach my son to trust his own voice again, and somewhere in the middle of watching that, I found myself trusting a few things of my own I thought I'd buried alongside Rebecca. That's not something I take lightly, Grace. And it isn't something I'm asking you to answer tonight either." Grace looked at him a long moment, at the barn and the snow, and the boy currently fussing over a horse blanket a short distance away, and felt something in her own chest that she had not permitted herself to examine too closely in 6 careful months. "I'm not in a hurry either," she said, "but I'm not opposed to finding out together what this becomes, provided we take it as slowly as Samuel needed us to take everything else." Caleb reached for her hand then, not urgently, simply resting his own weathered fingers over hers on the cold barn door, and neither of them moved to close the small remaining distance further just yet. It was enough, that evening, to stand together in the settling snow, with a boy nearby who had finally found his voice again, and to understand that whatever came next between the two adults would be built the same patient way everything else here had been built, one honest day at a time. Spring came slowly to Willow Bend that year, the way it always did in that high country, but it came fully in the end, the way most things eventually did for people willing to wait for them properly. Samuel rode Scout out to meet the schoolhouse wagon most mornings now, calling greetings to Grace before she'd even climbed down, and Caleb had taken to walking her to her own small house most evenings after supper, their conversations stretching longer each week without either of them rushing toward anything neither felt fully ready to name. Mrs. Eldridge stopped by the schoolhouse one afternoon that spring, not on official business, but simply to see for herself how Samuel was progressing, and she stayed the better part of an hour watching him read aloud to 2 younger students with a patience that mirrored Grace's own. She told Grace afterward, with the particular gruff sincerity of a woman unaccustomed to admitting she'd misjudged something, that she'd rarely been so glad to be proven entirely wrong about a method she'd once doubted so plainly. They married the following autumn, a small ceremony at the ranch with Samuel standing between them holding the small wooden horse, its chipped ear mended now with careful glue Caleb had applied himself one quiet evening. Grace kept teaching at the Willow Bend school, Mrs. Eldridge herself attending the wedding with a warmth that had grown steadily since that evening in the church hall, and Samuel grew into a boy who talked easily and often, though he still, on quiet evenings, sat with the wooden horse in his hands, remembering without fear the mother who had carved it for him and the 2 people who had helped him find his way back to his own voice.